Have you ever wondered why some people seem to effortlessly attract exactly what they want while you're working twice as hard and getting nowhere? What if I told you the answer has nothing to do with luck, destiny, or some cosmic lottery, and everything to do with a conversation you're having right now, in this very moment, that you don't even realize is happening? I'm talking about the silent dialogue running through your mind as you read these words. The quiet commentary, the automatic judgments, the subtle assumptions you make about yourself and your life without even noticing. That invisible conversation is doing something far more powerful than you've ever imagined. It's constructing tomorrow's reality with the precision of an architect building a skyscraper, one thought at a time. Florence Scovel Shinn discovered this truth during what she would later describe as her darkest hour. Everything around her seemed to be falling apart. The principles she taught others appeared to be failing in her own life. She stood at a crossroads where she could either abandon everything she believed or dig deeper into a mystery that would eventually crack open the secret to deliberate creation. What she found wasn't just another spiritual concept or motivational idea. It was a mechanism, a law operating with mathematical precision, governing how our inner world shapes our outer circumstances. But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. Here's where this gets interesting, and maybe a little uncomfortable. Most of us believe we're responding to reality, that we feel poor because our bank account is low, that we feel lonely because we're alone, that we feel stuck because circumstances won't change. Shinn discovered we've got it completely backwards. The feeling comes first. The circumstance follows. Always. Without exception. Think about the internal commentary that plays on repeat in your mind. When you look in the mirror, what's the first thing you say to yourself? When you check your bank balance, what sentence automatically forms in your thoughts? When you think about your future, what quiet assumption underlies every plan you make? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might be the reason those patterns keep repeating no matter how hard you try to break them. There's a specific sentence, just one, that you've been speaking internally without conscious awareness. It's been running like software in the background of your mind, executing commands, creating outcomes, building the very limitations you're desperately trying to escape. The fascinating part? You inherited this sentence. You didn't choose it. It was programmed into you through childhood, experiences, cultural conditioning, and the unconscious beliefs of everyone around you. But here's what changes everything. The same mechanism that created your current limitations can create your freedom. A man used this understanding to win over $80,000. A child manifested something every adult told him was absolutely impossible. Ordinary people have transformed their health, their relationships, their entire lives by grasping this single principle. What you're about to learn isn't complicated. In fact, the reason most people miss it is because they're looking for something more complex, more difficult, more worthy of the transformation they seek. But Shinn proved that the power to reshape reality lives in something far simpler than anyone imagined. The moment Shinn made her breakthrough, she wasn't sitting in meditation or reading ancient texts. She was in the middle of her own crisis, wrestling with doubt that felt suffocating. And that's when lightning struck. Her awareness, the doubt itself, wasn't some random emotion washing over her. It was a decision, an unconscious agreement she'd made with a belief system she never questioned. She'd been walking around with an invisible sentence playing on repeat. This won't work for me. I'm the exception. Things like this don't happen to people like me. Sound familiar? Most of us carry these sentences like invisible baggage. They're so familiar, we don't even hear them anymore. They've become the background, noise of our mental landscape, the default setting we operate from without realizing we're operating from anything at all. Shinn recognized that she'd been issuing commands to her subconscious mind all along, but the commands were all working against what she consciously wanted. Every time she felt doubt, she was essentially telling her deeper mind, make this harder, make this impossible, prove that I can't have what I desire. Now, I want to go even deeper into what makes this discovery so revolutionary. We've been conditioned from birth to believe that our feelings are reactions to external circumstances. You look at your empty bank account and naturally feel anxious about money. You experience rejection and naturally feel unworthy. You face obstacles and naturally feel discouraged. The entire structure of how we understand reality is built on this foundation. Outside events trigger inside responses, cause and effect flowing from the world into our consciousness. If this resonates with you, and you want to keep exploring how your inner world shapes your reality, go ahead and subscribe. There's a lot more we're going to unpack together. Shinn flipped this understanding completely upside down. What if the chain of causation runs in the opposite direction? What if your feeling of financial anxiety existed first, floating in your consciousness as an assumption about scarcity, and then your external circumstances arrange themselves to match that internal state? What if the feeling of unworthiness preceded the rejection, actually magnetizing experiences that confirmed what you already believed about yourself deep down? This isn't just positive thinking dressed up in different language. This is recognizing that consciousness itself is the creative force, and everything in your physical world is the echo of what's already happening in your inner world. You don't feel poor because your wallet is empty. Your wallet is empty because somewhere in the depths of your being, you've been occupying the state of poverty, speaking the language of lack, assuming scarcity as your default reality. The transformation happens when you grasp that you've never been trapped by circumstances. You've been trapped by the assumptions you didn't even know you were making. Write in the comments, "I see it differently now," if this is shifting something in how you understand your own patterns and why they keep repeating. Shinn made a choice that would alter everything. She stopped treating her thoughts like passengers on a train she couldn't control and started recognizing them as the conductor itself. In the quiet of her own mind, where nobody else could hear or judge, she began speaking differently to herself. Not louder, not with force, but with intention. She replaced the worn-out narratives of limitation with something entirely new. And here's where it gets almost unbelievable. The world around her started shifting in response. Doors that had been locked suddenly opened. People who had been obstacles became allies. Opportunities that seemed impossible began appearing with such natural timing that anyone watching from the outside would have called it coincidence. But Shinn knew better. She understood she wasn't bending reality through willpower or manipulating circumstances through strategy. She was simply allowing her external experience to catch up with the internal transformation that had already occurred. The outer world wasn't creating new conditions. It was reflecting back what she'd already established in consciousness. This is the hidden blueprint behind every story of unexpected fortune you've ever heard. That person who landed their dream job without applying? They'd already accepted it internally before the phone rang. The couple who found their perfect home after years of searching? They stopped looking from desperation and started living from the assumption of already being home. These aren't fairy tales or exceptions to some cosmic rule. They're demonstrations of a principle operating with absolute consistency, whether we're aware of it or not. Think about the prayers you've whispered in desperate moments. Some seemed to dissolve into silence, while others manifested with startling precision. The difference wasn't divine favoritism or random chance. The difference was in the energy behind the words. When you pray from fear, from lack, from a state of, "I don't have this and I desperately need it," you're reinforcing the very condition you're trying to escape. Your inner dialogue is screaming scarcity even while your lips are asking for abundance. But when someone prays, or simply assumes, from a place of already having received, from gratitude rather than grasping, something fundamentally different happens in the invisible realm where all creation begins. This mechanism doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about your education, your background, your past failures or successes. It responds only to the dominant tone of your internal conversation. The person who struggles despite working relentlessly hard is running one program in their mind, while trying to create a different outcome in their life. The person who seems to attract good fortune effortlessly has aligned their inner speech with their desired reality. They're not fighting against themselves. They're not contradicting their own intentions with subconscious beliefs that say, but not for me, but not yet, but probably not really. Leave a comment saying, inner speech creates, if you're beginning to recognize this pattern in your own journey. There's a man who walked away from a racetrack with a check that would make most people's eyes water. $84,000. Not from insider tips or years of studying horse racing statistics. He'd simply grasped something about how reality responds to certainty. Then there's a woman who'd been searching for the right home for what felt like forever, until she stopped searching and started living as if she'd already found it. Within weeks, a property appeared that matched every detail she'd quietly held in her mind. These aren't isolated miracles or strokes of divine intervention reserved for the spiritually gifted. They're demonstrations of a mechanism anyone can access once they understand the trigger. What these people stumbled upon was disarmingly simple. A single sentence, held with genuine conviction, spoken in the silence where only they could hear it. Not affirmations shouted at the mirror. Not wishes cast into the universe, hoping something out there might grant them. Just one quiet assumption repeated until it felt more real than the circumstances staring them in the face. That's the entire formula. One sentence, genuine feeling, consistency, and then watching as reality bends to accommodate what consciousness has already accepted as done. But here's what most people don't realize about Shinn's journey to this revelation. She didn't crack this code while lounging in some peaceful sanctuary surrounded by candles and ancient manuscripts. Her awakening came through the kind of darkness that makes you question whether you've wasted your entire life believing something fundamentally false. She faced nights where every principle she taught felt like empty words, where the gap between what she proclaimed and what she experienced became so wide she couldn't ignore it anymore. That pressure, that unbearable tension between belief and reality, forced her to look deeper, not into more books or teachings, but into the actual mechanics of how her own mind was constructing her experience, moment by moment. She had to get brutally honest about the conversations she was having with herself when no one was listening. The judgments, the doubts, the quiet resignation disguised as realism. All those hidden dialogues were building something, and what they were building looked nothing like what she claimed to want. Most breakthroughs don't come from comfort. They come from that fork in the road where you either abandon what you know or dig until you find why it's not working. Shinn chose to dig, and what she unearthed was that her suffering wasn't proof that the principles were false. It was proof that she was applying them backwards, speaking from lack while hoping for abundance, operating from fear while praying for peace. Drop a comment saying, "I'm digging deeper," if you've ever felt that same tension between what you believe should be possible and what you're actually experiencing. When everything conventional had failed her, when Shinn sat in the wreckage of her own contradictions, something clicked into focus with crystal clarity. She wasn't a victim of bad luck or cosmic injustice. She'd been the architect the entire time. Every frustrating pattern, every relationship that crumbled, every financial setback, none of it was happening to her. It was happening through her, generated by an underground stream of assumptions she'd never brought into daylight. The locked doors weren't external barriers. They were reflections of internal gates she'd bolted shut without realizing her hand was on the lock. This realization hits differently than most spiritual concepts because it removes every escape route. You can't blame the economy, your upbringing, other people's choices, or timing. The creative force wasn't somewhere out in the cosmos deciding your fate. It was operating through the lens of your own consciousness. Taking orders from beliefs you'd adopted so long ago, they felt like truth rather than opinion. Shinn saw that her reality wasn't random or chaotic. It was perfectly obedient to the instructions she'd been feeding it through years of unconscious repetition. But here's where the plot thickens. These instructions, these internal declarations that had been running her life, weren't something she'd deliberately installed. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to program themselves for struggle. These beliefs arrived through osmosis, through parents who meant well but operated from their own inherited fears, through teachers, media, cultural narratives that all whispered the same message: life is hard, resources are scarce, you need to fight for everything, and even then, you might not win. By the time we're old enough to question these assumptions, they've already burrowed so deep into our operating system that we mistake them for reality itself rather than interpretations of reality. If something clicked here that hadn't clicked before, hit that like button. It helps this reach people who are ready to hear it. We walk around repeating these invisible scripts like actors who've memorized lines without reading the full play. Someone cuts us off in traffic and we automatically think, people are selfish. We apply for a job, and before we even hit send, there's a whisper underneath saying, they probably won't pick me. We want something beautiful for ourselves, and immediately a voice chimes in with reasons why it's impractical, unlikely, or meant for someone else. Each of these moments is a creative act. Each thought is sculpting tomorrow's circumstances with more precision than our hands could ever manage in physical space. The game-changing insight isn't just recognizing that we create our reality. It's recognizing that we've been creating it all along with sentences we never consciously approved. Running on autopilot, building prisons we then spend our energy trying to escape. Type, I hear the script in the comments if you're starting to catch the background dialogue that's been running your experience. Right beneath the surface of what you can touch and measure, there's a system humming away that dictates more about your life than your resume, your connections, or your circumstances ever could. It's been working since before you could form complete sentences, calibrating your experiences to match a frequency you didn't choose but somehow agreed to. Broadcast. The fascinating part? This system has zero interest in your excuses. It doesn't pause to consider whether you've had a rough year or whether the odds are stacked against you. It just listens for one signal, the quiet declaration you make about who you are and what's available to you. And then it builds accordingly. Most people treat their thoughts like weather, something that just happens to them. Clouds roll in, moods shift, worries arrive uninvited. But what if those thoughts aren't random atmospheric conditions? What if they're the construction crew, showing up every morning to continue building whatever blueprint you handed them yesterday? The blueprint isn't written in any formal document. It exists in the running commentary you barely notice, the mental shorthand you use when nobody's watching, that half-second reaction when you see your bank balance, the instant judgment when you pass a mirror, the automatic assumption when you imagine next year. These micro moments don't feel significant because they're so ordinary, so habitual. But ordinary repetition is exactly how foundations get poured. Ask yourself what plays in your head when you think about money. Not what you'd say out loud at a dinner party, but the private verdict you've quietly reached. Is it, there's never enough, or it flows easily? When relationships come up in conversation, what's the undertone humming beneath your words? Is it trust or suspicion? When you picture your future, does it expand or contract in your imagination? Here's what makes this so slippery. We genuinely believe we're just observing reality when we think these thoughts. We think we're being honest, realistic, practical. But observation and creation aren't as separate as we've been taught. The moment you observe something and name it internally, you're also reinforcing it, giving it permission to continue, feeding it your attention and emotional energy. You're not a passive witness. You're an active participant. And the role you're playing is author, not audience. The difference between someone who seems magnetically lucky and someone who can't catch a break isn't talent or timing. It's the frequency of their internal broadcast, the story they're narrating to themselves in the gaps between obligations and distractions. Comment, I'm changing the broadcast if something about this is landing differently than what you've heard before. Let me be clear about something that trips people up constantly. When I talk about shifting your internal dialogue, I'm not suggesting you plaster on a grin and pretend your problems don't exist. That Instagram-style toxic positivity where everything's amazing all the time, that's not what this is. In fact, forcing yourself to perform happiness while your inner world is screaming the opposite just creates more resistance, more internal conflict. What we're talking about here operates on a completely different level. It's about the mechanics. Underneath your experience, the engineering of how thoughts solidify into things. Think of it like architecture. You don't build a skyscraper by putting a pretty facade on a crumbling foundation and calling it fixed. You go down to the bedrock, understand the soil composition, design a structure that can actually hold weight. Most self-help approaches are facade work. They're trying to change what you see without touching what's generating what you see. Shinn wasn't interested in surface renovations. She wanted to understand the blueprint itself, the invisible geometry that determines whether a building stands or collapses. What she uncovered wasn't another tool to add to an already crowded toolbox. It wasn't a meditation style or a journaling technique or a particular way to word your intentions. Those things can all be useful, but they're applications of something more fundamental. They're like different languages all describing the same underlying reality. Some people use visualization. Others use prayer. Some work with affirmations, others with scripting or acting as if. And here's the interesting part. When any of these methods actually work, when someone gets real results that shift their circumstances, there's always one common denominator running underneath the specific practice. That denominator is a shift in internal assumption, a change in the core sentence that's been running the show. You can meditate for hours, but if your baseline assumption about yourself remains, "I'm not enough," the meditation just becomes another activity that someone who's not enough does. You can affirm abundance all morning, but if underneath those words there's a quiet certainty that money is hard to come by, you're building on sand. The technique matters far less than the state you're operating from while you use it. Shinn realized she'd been chasing methods when she should have been examining the mechanism. Once you understand the mechanism, you can use any method or no method at all and still get results because you're working with the actual laws of how consciousness translates into form. Leave mechanism over method in the comments if this distinction is clicking into place for you. There's a story Shinn loved to tell about a kid who proved this whole thing works with zero spiritual training, no understanding of metaphysics, nothing except pure instinct. This boy was maybe 9 years old, sitting in the back of a room where his grandmother had dragged him while she attended one of Shinn's talks. He was probably bored, fidgeting with whatever toy he'd brought along, half listening while the adults around him took notes and nodded seriously. But somewhere in that hour, something Shinn said landed in his mind with perfect clarity, the kind of understanding that bypasses intellect and goes straight to knowing. On the way home, the kid announced he wanted a dog. Not just any casual, that would be nice someday wish, but a full certainty that this was happening. His grandmother nearly laughed out loud. She explained with absolute conviction that his parents would never allow it, that his father specifically couldn't stand dogs, that this wasn't even worth discussing. The circumstances were locked tight. Every adult in his life had already decided this particular door was sealed shut. But here's what makes this story so perfect. The boy didn't fight back. He didn't throw a tantrum or try to negotiate. He just smiled and went quiet, because he'd already heard something in that room that the adults had intellectualized into complexity. What happened next is where most people's brains short-circuit trying to make it logical. The kid started living as though he already had his dog, not in some desperate fantasy where he was escaping reality, but in a calm assumption that felt more natural to him than the supposed facts everyone kept repeating. Every night before sleep, he'd imagine walking his dog, feeling the leash in his hand, hearing the sound of paws on pavement. He didn't beg his parents, didn't leave hints around the house, didn't manipulate or strategize. He just quietly occupied a version of reality where he was a boy with a dog, and he did it with the kind of faith that hasn't been educated out of existence yet. 6 weeks later, his father, the man who'd sworn up and down that dogs were a hard no, walked through the front door carrying a puppy. He couldn't explain why he'd changed his mind. There was no logical progression of events that led to it. Something just shifted in him. Some internal resistance dissolved, and suddenly the decision that had been impossible became obvious. Type, Children know, if you're seeing why people who overthink this usually struggle more than people who just trust it. Watch a child operate in the world, and you'll notice something adults have forgotten. They don't require permission from reality before they believe something's possible. A kid will decide they're a superhero and fully inhabit that identity without needing peer-reviewed studies confirming that capes grant special abilities. They'll build entire universes out of cardboard boxes and believe in them completely. Then somewhere around adolescence, we teach them to be realistic, which is really just code for adopting the same limitations everyone else has agreed to carry. We train them to seek evidence before trust, to wait for proof before commitment, to protect themselves from disappointment, by expecting less. By the time we're adults, we've become experts at finding reasons why things won't work. We can spot potential obstacles before we've even tried. We've collected so many reference points of past failures that we treat them like scientific data, proving what's possible for us. Someone suggests an opportunity, and within seconds, our mind produces a detailed list of why it's unlikely, impractical, or meant for someone else. We call this wisdom, maturity, being grounded. But what if it's just accumulated resistance dressed up as intelligence? The weight of all these learned doubts creates a strange paradox. We want change, but we've built such elaborate defense systems against disappointment that we can't actually receive what we're asking for. It's like standing outside in the rain holding an umbrella and wondering why you're not getting wet. The protection itself becomes the problem. Children don't have this filter yet. They haven't learned to guard against hope. So when they want something, they just assume it's coming and act accordingly, which is exactly how the mechanism responds best. To assumption, not to wanting. Here's something that might shift your entire perspective on why you feel stuck. The limitations you keep running into aren't made of anything solid. They're linguistic constructs, sentences you've repeated so many times they've calcified into what appears to be unchangeable fact. I'm not good with money isn't a genetic trait. It's a story you've been telling that your subconscious accepted as an instruction manual. Relationships never work out for me isn't destiny. It's a prediction you keep proving right by operating from that premise. The bars on the cage are made of vocabulary, and the fascinating thing about words is they can be changed instantly, unlike circumstances which seem to require time and effort to shift. When you recognize that your reality is being held together by sentences rather than concrete, everything becomes fluid again. The moment you speak differently to yourself, you're not just changing your mood, you're issuing new orders to the part of your mind that builds your experience. Comment, words build worlds. If this is reframing how you see your own obstacles, picture the shelf in your mind where you've stored all the things that were supposed to change everything. The courses you bought at 2 a.m. when inspiration struck. The journal with the gratitude lists that started strong in January and faded by March. The meditation app you used religiously for a week. The book that promised to unlock abundance that you highlighted enthusiastically but never quite finished. You've been collecting keys, thinking one of them would finally fit the lock, and each time something new appears promising transformation. Part of you hopes, while another part quietly knows it'll probably end up on that same shelf with the others. This isn't because you're doing it wrong or because you're somehow cosmically blocked. You're not the exception to the rule, cursed to watch everyone else succeed while you stay stuck. You haven't failed to manifest because you secretly don't believe enough, or because your vibration is off, or because you're being punished for some past mistake. All of that is just noise. Additional layers of story that keep you searching externally for something that was never external to begin with. The actual issue, the only real issue, is simpler than any guru or program has probably told you. You've been working with the wrong raw material. Think of it like trying to bake bread but using salt instead of flour. It doesn't matter how perfect your technique is, how precisely you follow the recipe, or how expensive your oven is. Wrong ingredient means wrong result, every time. The ingredient we're talking about here isn't your affirmations or your visualization skills. It's the underlying assumption running in the background while you're performing all those. Techniques. It's the sentence that keeps playing when you're not actively trying to manifest anything, the default setting. Your mind returns to when you stop forcing it to think positively. You can stand in front of a mirror declaring wealth while your internal monologue quietly insists money is scarce. You can visualize perfect health while some part of you believes your body always betrays you. The conscious effort and the unconscious assumption are working against each other, and the unconscious wins that fight every time because it's louder where it counts, in the realm where creation actually happens. The solution isn't learning a better technique or finding the right teacher or trying harder. It's becoming aware of what you're actually saying to yourself when nobody's listening, and recognizing that those words are the real spell being cast. Drop wrong ingredient in the comments if you're realizing the methods weren't the problem. We've been sold a particular story about how to get what we want, and it's everywhere. Speak your dreams into existence, they say. Write them down with conviction. Cut out magazine images of the house you want, the body you want, the life you want, and stare at them every morning. The underlying logic sounds reasonable enough. Put your desires out there, declare them boldly, and reality will eventually catch up. It's like ordering from a cosmic restaurant menu. State your order clearly enough, persistently enough, and your dish will arrive. Except that's not how the kitchen actually works. The mechanism responding to your requests doesn't have ears for your spoken declarations or eyes for your carefully curated vision boards. It's not tallying up how many times you've written, "I am grateful for financial abundance" in your journal, waiting for you to hit some magic number before releasing the floodgates. The entire transactional framework we've been taught, do this external thing and get that external result, misses where the actual exchange is happening. What's really running the show is something most people never bring into conscious awareness because it's happening in a space we've been trained to ignore. It's the running commentary that never stops, the voice that narrates your life from the inside. Not the voice you project to the world or even to yourself in formal practices, but the unscripted, unedited stream that flows underneath everything else. That voice doesn't pause for affirmations. It's active while you're brushing your teeth, sitting in traffic, scrolling mindlessly through your phone. And it's speaking in a language that your deeper creative intelligence recognizes as command, not suggestion. Think about what happens after you finish your morning ritual of positive declarations. You've said all the right things, felt momentarily uplifted, maybe even believed it for those few minutes. Then you step out into your day, and the real operating system kicks back in. You see a price tag and automatically think expensive. You hear about someone's success, and somewhere underneath the congratulations, there's a whisper of must be nice, or that doesn't happen to people like me. These aren't dramatic moments. They're tiny, forgettable micro-thoughts that seem completely harmless. But they're the actual instructions being processed by the part of your consciousness that builds your world. The universe, or whatever you want to call the responsive field of reality, doesn't parse meaning from your public performances. It reads the energetic signature of what you genuinely assume to be true, and that signature lives in your private mental atmosphere, not your vision board. Write private signal if you're catching on to why the external stuff hasn't been cutting through. Here's what trips up most people who are genuinely trying to shift their reality. They'll pump themselves up with powerful language, really feel it for a moment, maybe even get chills from the conviction in their own voice. Then life happens. An email arrives. A bill lands. Someone posts their vacation photos. And in the split second between that trigger and their next breath, a completely different narrative takes over. It's so automatic they might not even register it consciously, but it's there. A reflexive response that undoes whatever they just built. You tell yourself you're worthy of incredible relationships, and for that moment, you might genuinely feel it. Then later that day, you're alone with your thoughts, and a familiar voice shows up, asking why you always end up on the outside looking in. Or you spend 10 minutes convincing yourself that money flows easily, feeling optimistic and aligned, and then you're in a checkout line mentally calculating whether you can actually afford what's in your cart. running through your usual mental math of scarcity. The problem isn't that you lied during the affirmation. The problem is that the truth for you, the actual operating belief, lives in those unguarded moments, not in the rehearsed ones. What makes this so tricky is that we're not dealing with occasional thoughts here. This isn't about having a bad thought once in a while that sabotages an otherwise clean mental diet. The conversation happening in your head is relentless. It's running while you're making coffee, stopped at red lights, waiting for a web page to load, lying in bed before sleep finally takes you. You're narrating your experience nonstop, providing commentary on everything you encounter, labeling it, judging it, comparing it to past patterns, and predicting future outcomes based on those patterns. And here's the part that sounds almost too simple to be true. That ongoing narration isn't just passive observation. It's generative. Every casual judgment you make about yourself or your circumstances is like a brushstroke on a canvas that becomes tomorrow's landscape. When you habitually frame things a certain way, when you default to particular interpretations of what's happening around you, you're not just describing your world. You're encoding instructions for what comes next. The person who mentally tags every unexpected expense as just my luck is issuing very different commands than the person who frames the same situation as it always works out. Neither of them is lying. They're both being honest about their real assumption, and that assumption is what gets built. Comment, always speaking, if you're recognizing how much. Dialogue is actually running through your day. Most people treat their thoughts like background noise, just mental static that doesn't really count for much. But imagine if every stray comment you made to yourself was being recorded and filed away by someone whose entire job is to make sure your experience matches what you keep saying. That's essentially what's happening, except there's no person doing the filing. It's a system, and it doesn't distinguish between what you meant seriously and what you muttered absent-mindedly. It just registers the frequency, the tone, the underlying assumption behind your words, and starts arranging circumstances to reflect that back to you. When you pass a mirror and think something critical about your appearance, that's not just a momentary lapse in self-esteem. You're literally imprinting an identity, confirming a verdict you've already reached about who you are and what you're worth. When you look at your schedule and sigh internally about how there's never enough time, you're not observing a neutral fact about your calendar. You're reinforcing a relationship with time itself, one where scarcity is the governing principle. These micro-declarations feel inconsequential because they're so ordinary, so reflexive, but they're actually the most consequential thing you do all day because they're happening in the space where reality gets assembled. Think of it like compound interest, but for consciousness. One dismissive thought about yourself doesn't crater your life. But that same thought, repeated daily for years, that's not just repetition, that's construction. You're building an identity, a self-concept that eventually becomes so solid it feels like who you've always been rather than who you've been practicing being. The person who constantly frames their efforts as not good enough isn't just being self-critical. They're actively generating a version of themselves that struggles to recognize achievement, even when it's staring them in the face. And here's what makes this so powerful and so dangerous at the same time. Your inner dialogue isn't creating possibilities or probabilities. It's creating inevitabilities. When you genuinely believe something about yourself or your life at that deep, unexamined level, you don't get a version of reality where maybe that belief plays out. You get the version where it absolutely does. Because every decision you make, every opportunity you notice or ignore, every risk you take or avoid is being filtered through that belief system. You're not manifesting from scratch. You're manifesting from whatever foundation you've already spent years laying down through habitual self-talk. Type building daily. If you're seeing how the small repetitive thoughts matter more than the big occasional ones. There's a subtle violence we commit against ourselves every day without realizing it. We look at our bank statement and instantly label it with familiar language. Tight, stressful, never enough. We think we're just being honest, calling it like we see it. But what feels like neutral observation is actually active instruction. The part of your mind that doesn't argue with you, that takes your word as law, hears never enough, and gets to work making sure that stays true. It's not being malicious. It's just doing its job, which is matching your external experience to your internal declarations. Same thing happens when you catch your reflection and immediately catalog everything. That doesn't measure up. You're not discovering flaws that were objectively there waiting to be noticed. You're making a choice about what to emphasize, what to focus on, what story to tell about the person looking back at you. And that story, told enough times with enough feeling behind it, becomes the lens through which you interpret every interaction. Someone compliments you, and you dismiss it as politeness. Someone shows interest, and you assume they'll lose it once they know you better. Not because that's what's actually happening, but because you've already reached a conclusion about your own value, and now you're just gathering evidence to support it. The wild part is that none of this is permanent. The reality you're living in right now, the one that feels so fixed and solid, was built by sentences you weren't paying attention to, which means it can be rebuilt by sentences you choose deliberately. The shift isn't complicated or mystical. It happens the second you stop letting your mind run on autopilot and start treating your thoughts like the creative tools they actually are, not controlling every single thought, which would be exhausting and impossible, but catching the big ones, the recurring themes, the default scripts that play when you're not consciously directing the show. This is where people either get it or they don't. Some hear this and immediately understand they've been handed the master key. Others keep searching for something more elaborate, more difficult, more worthy of the transformation they want. But the mechanism doesn't care about complexity. It responds to repetition, to genuine feeling, to the difference between wishing something were true and assuming it already is. When you make that shift, when you start speaking to yourself from the end result rather than from the gap you're trying to close, something fundamental changes in how you move through the world. Comment, "I'm choosing now," if you're ready to stop running on default programming. Let me tell you about someone who proved this works in a way that's hard to dismiss as coincidence. This wasn't a spiritually inclined person doing years of inner work. This was a regular guy who heard Shinn explain this principle and decided to test it with something specific and measurable. He chose the racetrack, which most people would consider pure chance, a place where your thoughts supposedly have no bearing on outcomes that depend on horses, jockeys, weather, 1,000 variables you can't control. For 3 weeks straight, this man ran an experiment. Every single night before sleep, he did something that probably looked ridiculous to anyone watching, but felt perfectly natural to him. He imagined he'd already won. Not that he was going to win. Not that he hoped to win. But that it was done, finished, in the past. He'd picture himself holding the winning tickets, feeling the texture of them between his fingers. He'd imagine the sensation of walking up to collect his money, the weight of it, the reality of it. And crucially, he'd let himself feel whatever would naturally arise if this were genuinely happening. Probably relief, maybe disbelief, definitely gratitude. This wasn't wishful thinking or fantasy. It was something more deliberate. He was practicing a state of being, rehearsing an identity, the identity of someone for whom this outcome had already occurred. And he did this in that threshold moment right before sleep, when your conscious mind starts loosening. Its grip and your subconscious becomes more impressionable. 21 nights of this. No skipping, no half-hearted attempts, just consistent immersion in a reality that didn't exist yet physically, but was completely real in his inner world. Then something shifted. He felt pulled to go to the track on a particular day, not from desperate hope, but from quiet certainty. And what happened there defies what most people understand about probability and random outcomes. He won, not a small amount, $84,000. The exact scenario he'd been living internally for 3 weeks materialized in the physical world with almost absurd precision. Was it luck? Maybe, if you believe in a universe that randomly distributes fortune. Or maybe it was demonstration of a law most people don't know exists, that sustained assumption, held with feeling in the fertile ground of consciousness, eventually hardens into fact. Right, state before circumstance, if you're grasping why he won before he went to the track. Your brain doesn't actually distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and one that happened in physical reality. This isn't metaphysics, it's neuroscience. When you recall a memory, certain neural networks light up. When you imagine something with enough sensory richness and emotional texture, those exact same networks activate. Your nervous system doesn't have a fact checker running in the background, verifying which experiences were real and which were imagined. It just files everything based on the electrical and chemical signals it receives. An imagination backed by genuine feeling produces the same signals as lived experience. This is why that man's nightly ritual worked. He wasn't pretending or playing make-believe in some childish sense. He was encoding a memory of an event that hadn't happened yet in linear time, but was completely real in the dimension where all creation originates. By the time he physically walked into that racetrack, his subconscious mind had already logged 21 instances of him winning. The outcome wasn't future, it was past. He was just showing up to collect what had already been established internally. What makes this even more compelling is that someone else heard this story and immediately understood it wasn't about horses or gambling. It was about mechanism. This second person didn't copy the first man's exact scenario because that would have been hollow, inauthentic. Instead, he crafted his own version, his own scene that carried genuine feeling for him personally. He designed an internal experience that implied financial success in a way that resonated with his specific psychology, then committed to the same practice, nightly immersion in the state of already having what he wanted. 1 month. That's all it took. $16,000 showed up in his life through a completely different avenue than the first man's path. The amount was different, the circumstances were different, but the principle was identical. And this is what separated coincidence from law. One instance could be dismissed as luck. 2 people using the same method and both getting measurable results. That starts looking like something you can rely on, something that operates with consistency regardless of who applies it. The implications here are staggering if you really sit with them. These weren't special people with mystical abilities. They were ordinary individuals who understood that the real work of manifestation happens in consciousness before it happens in circumstance, and they were willing to do that work consistently without needing to see proof first. Leave 2 proofs pattern if you're recognizing this is repeatable, not random. The second winner didn't stop at one success. Anyone can get lucky once, right? But he wanted to know if this was actually a principle he could rely on, or just a fluke. So he pointed his attention at something more mundane, less dramatic, his bank accounts. He picked 2 specific institutions and assigned each one a number that would have seemed ambitious given his current financial reality. 10,000 in one, 15,000 in the other. Not lottery-level money, just enough to prove to himself that consciousness could shape material outcomes with precision. Again, the nightly practice. Again, the act of living it internally before it existed externally. He'd imagine walking into each bank, having casual conversations with tellers who recognized him, requesting his balance and seeing those exact figures on the screen. What's fascinating is that he had no idea how this money would arrive. He wasn't scheming or strategizing. He wasn't working extra hours or investing in some opportunity. He just held the state, trusted the law, and let the bridge of incidents build itself behind the scenes where human effort can't reach. Within weeks, not months, not years, both balances materialized exactly as he'd imagined them. And here's the kicker: the path they took to get there wasn't anything he could have orchestrated consciously. The money showed up through a series of events so specific and unlikely that trying to make them happen through conventional action would have been impossible. This is what people miss when they think manifestation is about working harder or being smarter. The intelligence orchestrating these outcomes operates at a level your planning mind can't access. Your job isn't to figure out the how. Your job is to establish the what and maintain the state until reality catches up. Then there's the kid with the dog, which might be the most perfect example of all because children don't overcomplicate this. A 9-year-old doesn't sit around analyzing whether his thoughts are quantum entangled with probability fields. He just wants a puppy. So every night he pretends he already has one. Simple, pure. No resistance, no backup plan, no hedging. Just complete immersion in a reality where he's a boy with a dog, going on. Walks, feeling that companionship. 6 weeks of this, and his father, who'd been absolutely opposed, who genuinely couldn't stand dogs, shows up with a puppy and can't even explain his own reversal. That's not persuasion. That's not the kid wearing him down. That's reality reshaping itself around a sustained internal assumption, proving once again that what you hold as true in consciousness becomes true in form. Drop reality follows assumption, if this pattern is becoming undeniable to you. There's an ancient text that gets quoted all the time, usually in contexts that completely miss what it's actually saying. In the beginning was the Word. Most people hear that and picture some cosmic voice booming across an empty void billions of years ago, a one-time creative event that kicked off existence and then stopped. But what if that's not describing something that happened once? What if it's describing something that's happening constantly, including right now as you're taking in these words? The creative principle being described isn't external. It's not some deity speaking from outside the system. It's the voice inside your own awareness, the perpetual narration that never stops running. That's the word that creates worlds, not ancient scripture or divine proclamation, but the living language moving through your consciousness in this exact moment. Every internal comment, every silent judgment, every assumption you make about what's possible or impossible is an act of creation happening in real time. You're not remembering some past creation. You're actively participating in ongoing creation with every thought you think. This completely changes how you approach your own life when you really get it. Because if the creative word is your inner speech, then you have a perfect diagnostic system built right into your experience. You don't need to guess why certain patterns keep showing up or why specific limitations feel impossible to break through. Just listen to what you're actually saying to yourself when nobody's around to hear it. Listen to the automatic commentary that runs when you're doing ordinary things, driving, eating, falling asleep. That soundtrack is your blueprint. It's showing you exactly what you're currently assuming to be true. And those assumptions are generating matching circumstances with absolute fidelity. Someone struggling financially doesn't need a psychic to tell them why. They just need to pay attention to their mental refrain. Around money, is it scarcity-based? Is it anxious? Does it frame every transaction as loss or depletion? That's not a symptom of being broke. That's the cause of staying broke. Same with relationships, health, career, anything. The pattern in your life and the pattern in your thoughts aren't coincidentally similar. They're the same pattern expressed in different dimensions, and the thought pattern came first. This is empowering information once you stop resisting it, because it means you're never confused about what needs to change. You don't need to analyze your childhood or decode your chart or wait for perfect timing. You just need to catch yourself mid-sentence and realize you're authoring tomorrow's reality with today's internal dialogue. Comment listening closer if you're starting to hear your own patterns with new clarity. The guidance embedded in ancient wisdom is more practical than people realize. It's not telling you to suppress negativity through willpower or force yourself into artificial positivity. It's pointing to a fundamental shift in orientation. Stop speaking from where you are and start speaking from where you want to be. Most people get this backwards because it feels dishonest at first. You're looking at an empty bank account while trying to claim abundance. You're sitting alone while attempting to embody partnership. The logical mind screams that you're lying to yourself. But here's the distinction that unlocks everything. You're not lying. You're selecting which reality to tune into. Multiple versions of your life exist simultaneously as potential, and the one that materializes depends entirely on which station you're broadcasting from. When you speak from lack, I need money, I want love, I hope things get better, You're selecting the frequency where those things remain absent. When you speak from fulfillment, I have more than enough, I'm so loved, everything's working out. You're selecting a completely different channel, one where those conditions already exist and are simply waiting to become visible. The practical application is deceptively simple, which is why most people overlook it searching for something more complex. You need one sentence, not a manifesto, not a vision statement, not a collection of affirmations. One sentence that you would naturally think if your desire was already done. This is where people trip up. They construct sentences that reveal they're still reaching for something rather than resting in something. I will be wealthy is future tense, which means you're not wealthy now. I want to be healthy contains wanting, which implies lacking. The sentence has to be present tense, past tense, or simply assumptive, phrased in a way that only makes sense coming from someone who already has what they want. If you desired financial ease, you wouldn't walk around thinking, I'm trying to get money. You'd think things like, it's always there when I need it, or I love this freedom. If you wanted a loving relationship, you wouldn't be mentally rehearsing, someday someone will love me. You'd be thinking from inside that relationship, I can't believe how well we understand each other, or this just keeps getting better. The sentence reveals your actual position, and your position determines what shows up. Type one sentence if you're ready to identify what you'd actually say to yourself from the fulfilled state. The timing of when you do this work matters more than most people realize. You could repeat your sentence 1,000 times during the day while you're fully alert and get minimal results, but say it once in that specific window right before sleep and it sinks in completely differently. There's a reason every tradition that understands consciousness points to this threshold moment. It's when your defenses are down, when the part of you that argues and analyzes and questions is starting to dissolve. Your subconscious is wide open in that state, impressionable in a way it never is when you're fully awake and armored against new information. So here's the practice stripped of all ceremony and complication. Tonight when you're in bed, get comfortable and let your body go slack. Don't fight for alertness. Let yourself drift toward that fuzzy boundary where you're not quite awake but not yet asleep. In that space, bring up your sentence, the one that implies your wish is already done. Say it internally with enough attention that you're not just mechanically repeating words, but you're actually inhabiting what those words mean. Feel them. Let them generate whatever emotional response would naturally arise if this were genuinely your reality. Then let that be the last thing you're conscious of before you slip under. What you carry into sleep doesn't just evaporate. It gets impressed into the deeper layers of your mind that don't distinguish between fantasy and fact. This is why people who fall asleep worrying wake up anxious. They've been marinating in that state for hours while their conscious resistance was offline. You're just using the same mechanism deliberately, feeding it the state you want instead of the one you're trying to escape. But here's where most people quit, right before it would have worked. They try it for 3 nights, don't see immediate results, and assume it's not working. The guys who won money didn't do this once and cash out. One committed to 21 nights. The kid stayed with it for 6 weeks. Not because the universe is slow, but because you need to override years of contrary programming. You need to saturate yourself in the new assumption until it feels more familiar than the old one, until thinking from your desire becomes automatic rather than something you have to remind yourself to do. You're not trying to convince some external force to grant your wish. You're convincing yourself, reprogramming your default settings, establishing a new baseline. And once that new baseline is set, once you genuinely feel like someone who has what they want, the external circumstances have no choice but to conform. Right, tonight I start, if you're committing to actually doing this instead of just understanding it intellectually. So here we are. If you've made it all the way to this point, that tells me something about you. You're not just passively consuming content hoping for entertainment. You're actually searching for something that works, something real that you can apply tonight and see results from. That kind of intentionality is rare, and it's exactly what this work requires. I create content like this because I believe this knowledge shouldn't stay locked in old books or dressed up in language that makes it inaccessible. The mechanics of how consciousness shapes reality should be clear, practical, and available to anyone willing to test it. If what we've covered here resonates with you, if you want to keep exploring how your inner world builds your outer experience, go ahead and subscribe. There's a lot more we're going to unpack together about how this actually works in different areas of your life. And hey, if this landed differently than other things you've heard, if something clicked that hadn't clicked before, leave a comment saying, "This message was meant for me. I read through those, and it helps me understand what's actually serving you, what's cutting through the noise and making a real difference." If you found value in this, hit that like button. It's a small thing, but it helps this reach other people who are ready to hear it. People who are tired of surface-level advice and want to understand the actual mechanism underneath everything. There's another video right here that goes deeper into how to handle resistance when it shows up, because it will. Click on it and let's keep going. I'll see you there.